everyone, I'm Cassandra Xiao, and I'm about to interview Sara Harberson. She is a nationally recognized authority on elite college admissions. She has held positions such as the Associate Dean of Admissions at the University of Pennsylvania and the Dean of Admissions at Franklin and Marshall College. She founded Admissions Revolution, a free website with the key information for students applying to college. Seniors, pay close attention. She will be answering your questions on the flaws in the system, how to write essays, Asian bias, and more. What is the biggest thing a senior can do this late in the game? I mean, it is October. We've already done all the activities we possibly can. What should we be focusing on?
Yeah. There are a lot of students that start the college process right about now, and that's okay. So there are going to be some colleges and universities that are going to have open houses still for seniors. And obviously they are open usually Monday through Friday and sometimes even on the weekends for tours and information sessions. But to get started, if a senior is a little bit late, it's going to be important to get those applications in order, start writing essays, making sure that they speak to their teachers about writing letters of recommendation for them. And I think it's even time to consider, should I be applying early decision or early action? As you know, those deadlines are approaching. One of the big ones is October 15th for University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Also, Georgia Tech is due October 15th if you're applying early action to either one of those places. But a lot of the early decision, early action deadlines are usually around November 1st, sometimes November 15th. But most students apply to college in regular decision, and that deadline is going to be around January 1st. So there's still plenty of time to get applications in order, essays written, teachers ask for letters of recommendation. But something that students can do now, even before they submit their application, is to send their test scores to the colleges and universities that are going to be on their list. And sending those test scores now is important because you don't want there to be a delay in your scores getting to the colleges and universities on time. And it's okay to send those scores even before your application is sent. Last year, there was a really big testing delay, and there were students who were waiting until a week or so before the deadline to send their scores, and their scores ended up taking much longer than a week or so. Sometimes it was 3-4 weeks before those scores reached the colleges.
Mm-hmm. And some colleges, they don't require you to send your standardized test scores. What are your thoughts on that? We are seeing a movement towards, not requiring students to submit those scores.
Yeah, when I was applying to college, there were just a handful of those institutions. They were mostly small liberal arts colleges, great small liberal arts colleges. Now that list has grown to hundreds, and there are a variety of different types of colleges and universities that have a test optional policy, from a larger university like Temple University or Wake Forest to a small liberal arts college. Bowdoin College, I believe, was one, if not the first college to go test optional. So there are hundreds of these institutions to choose from. I think it is a great way to go for students, especially those that have a very strong high school record and feel like that is the best representation of who they are as a student and what they're capable of doing in college. I've worked at a university that requires standardized tests, and I've also worked at a college that has had a test optional policy, so I've seen both. I think the one thing that really surprised me when I went to work for a test optional college was I still felt in the back of my mind that maybe they didn't evaluate those applications in the same way, but I was so pleasantly surprised that if a student did not submit their scores, their acceptance into that institution was about the same admit rate as if it was a student who did submit their test scores with the application. Mm-hmm. So I'm a firm believer in test optional colleges. I applied to a number of them when I was a high school senior, and having worked for one, I really believe in it. What was really great to see when I worked for a test optional college was that there was literally years of data that supported the idea that students who do well in high school, that is a that is the best predictor of how they will do in college. That standardized tests can give you a glimpse of how they do on a test. But those grades that they get in high school, it's really the best preparation to do well in college.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've been, part of this behind the scenes for such a long time. In your eyes, what is the biggest flaw in the college admissions process?
The biggest flaw would be that this process moves so quickly on the college's end. And what I mean by that is these admissions officers are being asked to read sometimes hundreds of applications a day. And when you're reading applications that quickly, you really have to speed read every piece of the application. There's no longer any time for the admissions officer to get to know the student even before the process. And especially when they start reading an application, it is done so quickly. And even faster is how a decision is made. So let's say an admissions officer is reading an application in a couple of minutes. A decision can be made in literally seconds. And so because of the number of applications that are coming in, because of the pressure on these admissions officers, they are not going to be reading the applications very quickly. And so for a student that has a more subtle approach, they may not stand out in the applicant pool because they are not putting everything front and center. So when I'm working with students or talking about the college process with families, I really encourage them to think very thoughtfully about each piece of the application so that every section of the application is truly the best representation of who that student is, because the application is going to be read so very quickly, and an admissions decision will be made even faster.
Now, as you said, there's so little time for them to even process, this student, but what are some of the immediate sort of red flags that may leap out at an application? Are there any red flags that are, fodder for an immediate no? What is sort of the process behind that?
There are little things that students do that, in this competitive applicant pool, it can make or break an application. So, right now I'm working with a lot of students that are filling out the Common App. I really encourage students to use the extracurricular activities list, that activities list, and really represent all the things that are really important to them. But if there is a typo, a really big typo, that can sometimes make an admissions officer think twice. Or if the student doesn't respond to the prompt, and they end up writing an essay that really goes in a very different direction and doesn't answer the question being asked of them. Or the student is being asked to submit letters of recommendation from academic teachers, but they end up asking teachers in non-academic areas or people in their community. You really want to read the prompts, the directions, the instructions, and also follow the deadlines. Mm-hmm. There are going to be some colleges and universities that have very strict deadlines. And so if the deadline is November 1st and you apply November 2nd, in some cases, they might not accept your application. Mm-hmm. So there are little things that can happen. There are big things too. If a student decides, I'm going to take it easy senior year. I'm not going to take all those advanced level classes that I was taking junior year because I want my senior year to be a piece of cake. Those students, if they're applying to highly selective colleges, are really going to find that those colleges aren't going to respond to them because these colleges want to see students performing at the highest level even throughout senior year. Mm-hmm. So things to keep in mind. Also, when a college says something is optional, it truly is optional. But I think if you have an opportunity to do something and you really want to show how interested you are in that institution, I always tell students to do the optional essays, do anything extra that you need to. It doesn't mean that you send in additional materials that's not being asked of you, but if there is an optional essay especially, I tell students to go for it and write that essay, as long as it is as powerful as the other pieces of the application.
Does that go for recommendations as well? Because some recommendations are optional, but I know that they are pressed for time. Do they really take the time to read through those optional recommendations from outside in the community?
When I was in college admissions, the best letters of recommendation always came from the student's high school.
Mm.
Even if the student knew someone important or knew a celebrity or knew a politician, you'd be surprised. Those letters never were able to deliver the kind of information that the letters from the teachers, the academic teachers, and the school counselor in some cases were able to provide the college admissions committee. So I tell students to really work with the educators at their high school first and foremost. There are going to be some colleges that say if you want to send an additional letter, you can. But when these admissions officers are pressed for time, they might just glance at that extra letter. Or if they see that the student sent in a lot of additional materials or a lot of letters of recommendation, the admissions officer starts to look at that application in a different light. Like, what is that student trying to overcome? What are they trying to overcompensate for? And so if you can, focus on what is required, especially for those letters of recommendation, because the best letters are really going to come from those academic teachers.
Now, talking about the essays, I know for me and a lot of my peers, the question that we struggle is the why us question. Why do you want to come to our institution? And we're not sure whether to talk about, do colleges want us to sort of, spew back to them what they already know about their college, or is it talking more about us and how we are a good fit for that school?
Yeah, such a great question. The why Penn, the why Yale, all of the why Duke, yes, why Columbia. They tend to be, for the most part, for most students, they tend to be the harder essays to write. The students who seem to have a better approach and a better essay have spent time visiting that campus, or if they haven't been able to visit campus, they have really immersed themselves as much as they possibly can in learning about that institution. That being said, you're right, you have to be careful. You can't just repeat everything that's on the website word for word. You almost have to take that in, analyze it, and be able to put your own personal spin out on it. But those essays usually are a reflection of how much effort the student is putting into that application, that supplemental piece of the application, and how badly the student is really interested, how much they really want that college or university. I just read a great essay the other night from a student that wrote one of those why I'm interested in your institution essays. And it was spectacular. And I said to her, I said, how did you write this? This is usually the hardest essay to write. And she said, well, by the way, I spent 2.5 days on campus and I took notes. And every time I had this wonderful moment, this aha moment, I wrote it down. And then when I went back to write this essay, it all came back to me very easily. And it felt like I was such a great match because I knew a lot about the institution and I was able to put into words. So time spent on campus, time spent learning about the institution, time spent talking to undergraduate students who are there or alumni who are in your community, all that can help with that essay, which is always a hard one to write.
Yeah, and what makes it harder is that in some cases they only give you this many words, and it's like, how do you fit all that want into, say, 100 words? And that's just it. Yeah.
I think, and the default seems to be, and I used to see this when I worked at Penn and when I worked at F&M, and I see it now on the other side of the process when I work with students one-on-one. It's so easy to look up the major that you want, look up some courses, look up a professor, and then just plug it into that essay, kind of the last sentence of each paragraph. And I would like to take managerial economics by Professor so-and-so, or the ethnography of Philadelphia by this professor. I think that is an easy way to list things that are a part of the institution, but these colleges are really looking for more. They're really looking to see how you're able to grapple with the things that are being offered there. But then there are some colleges that have supplemental essays that have nothing to do, or at least seemingly have nothing to do with the institution. You look at the Princeton supplement, for example, and their questions really get the student to think. And I always tell students who are having trouble with the Princeton supplement, it's almost like getting into the mind of a Princeton student. And you really have to understand what Princeton's all about to know what they're looking for those supplemental essays.
Wow. Switching gears here, I know you are a big speaker, a big advocate for Asian Americans, and sort of revealing the other side that many people might not know, that there is an Asian bias. Can you talk about this Asian bias in the college admissions process?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's been going on for decades. I think we all go into whatever we do, whether it's a job or an environment or going into school, and we have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. I think in college admissions, we've taken Asian American students for granted. There are so many of them applying to elite colleges and universities across the country, and they are generally putting together incredible applications with very high test scores. They usually have the highest test averages in an applicant pool, highest grades, the most advanced curriculum that the students can possibly take. But there are so many of them, and I think they've been taken for granted for a really long time. And in many ways, they've been nameless. Of course, students put their names on the application, but they're nameless because no one's discussed this for decades. No one's fighting for them. No one was giving a voice to what was going on. And colleges and universities don't have to answer to anyone. A lot of these elite institutions are following a process called holistic admissions. They don't have to give anyone a reason for why they admit a student or why they don't admit a student. So you have thousands of Asian Americans and Asian students in these applicant pools, and they become nameless because no one is fighting for them. No one is saying you've got to admit the student. No one's picking up the phone and saying, I know so-and-so and I'm going to go to bat for him, or I'm going to go to bat for her. And then the decisions go out, and these students are often waitlisted or sometimes deferred if they apply early decision or early action, or they're ultimately denied, and no one is speaking up for them. What's interesting is we now have a number of lawsuits that are coming out of the woodwork, or complaints being filed with the U.S. Department of Education. And we're beginning to hear the names of some of these students. And I remember when the first name came out last year, and for me, it was such an important moment in the history of elite college admissions, because it was the first time in many ways we were saying this student with a name is standing up and saying this cannot happen again and again. And so I think we are beginning to see a major shift. Whether colleges and universities want to admit it or not, I believe that they are being watched carefully. They are finally beginning to be under what I hope to be a microscope of some sort. Whether it's the university leadership, the president, the board of trustees, these admissions offices need to be able to answer to somebody. They can't just make any decision they want and not be able to back it up. Mm-hmm. And so, I almost feel like, the Asian Americans are nameless no more because of these complaints being filed and because we're beginning to talk about it. And I think it's a powerful movement and a trend that is not going to go away. And, I'm hopeful and optimistic about what's to come. But I think in many ways, colleges and universities are going to always want what they don't have. So let's say they are an East Coast college and they want students from the Pacific Northwest, or they are a large university that is looking for students from a certain background that they don't have in their, or don't have many of in their student body. In many ways, college admissions, especially selective college admissions, is almost about being able to get the students that the institution has historically not been able to admit and enroll and get them to come to campus. Yet the students that they have plenty of in their applicant pool are sometimes cast aside, many times cast aside, because there are so many of them. And there is no voice or advocate within that admissions office who is leading the charge to say these students are getting pushed aside, and there's no good reason. And just because they aren't calling up complaining, or they don't have someone important writing a letter or picking up the phone to call the university president, these students need to be recognized, acknowledged, celebrated, admitted, and brought into the fold.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the holistic process, and there are just so many factors that, we as students, we can't change our race, we can't change our geography, whether or not we are legacies, citizens, our family income. But in the areas that we can focus on, how do we increase sort of visibility and be that student that colleges are looking for, as you said?
I think it goes back to one of your first questions. What is the biggest flaw of this process? These applications are read so quickly. And so as students, I really encourage them to think about how quickly an admissions officer is going to be reading over the things that are in their control, that they can influence. And those would be your activities list and your essays. Those are two really big pieces of the application, especially for institutions that have holistic admissions. Because if you have high grades and you have high test scores, these admissions officers are going to be looking for more. So when you are filling out the activities list, you want to be thinking not just about what leadership title that you have that you can list, but the impact that you've had on that activity, that club, that job, that family responsibility. And so the description is, I think, just as important as the position or title that you are listing on that activities list. And so instead of wasting space on that description line about an organization that is fairly common and predictable for a high school student to do, the student should really be thinking about, well, what have I done for that club or that team or that organization? Is it that I organized a citywide event? That should be included. Is it that you got published in the LA Times or a magazine, or your paper got published in a journal? You want to be specific about the things that you've done. There's a great application out there. I don't know if you've heard of the institution. It's called Minerva. It's a very new institution, and their application is very different than the typical college application. They're asking for students to list the things that are important to them, almost like an activities list, but they're asking for evidence. And what they mean by evidence is, what have you done to contribute to that club, that activity, and that sport? And it could be a link to an article about what you've done. It could be a link to something you've published. It could be a link to your artwork, but you want to show evidence. And I think the way that they approach extracurricular activities is a beautiful way, because it allows the student to take control and say, this is what I've done. And that's why I'm putting it on my extracurricular activities list. So activities is one way to really get the attention of an admissions officer. But I also think your writing, your essays are such a powerful, clear message about who you are and what you want that admissions committee to know about you. There's so many topics that students can write about. But they should be thinking about how they're going to approach that topic and how they're going to present themselves in a way that nobody else in the world is going to be able to do. And so you can write about a very simple topic, like a very routine thing that you do. Maybe you take 2 different buses to get to school every morning and 2 buses on the way home. You can find an incredible story within just your commute every day. It doesn't have to be this monumental event in your life. It could be something simple and pure. But if you're able to recognize the beauty in it and the power in that story and put it into words, you are going to move that admissions officer to fight for you.
Absolutely. And this is my last question. There are so many counselors like you who offer, this is the number you want to shoot for in terms of how many colleges you are applying for. So what would that number be for you? What is your advice?
Yeah, I don't have a magic number. I feel like for every student, it's different. I think it can be 3 or 4. It can be 15. As long as the student recognizes that, especially when you're talking about elite schools, all the elite schools are going to have some sort of a supplement, and those supplements take time, and those essays take time to write. But I think it really depends on the student. If financial aid is a big consideration and you're hoping to get a merit scholarship, you might be applying to a few more schools. If you're coming from a certain background, it might be smart to apply to more schools. If you know the type of institution that you want and your grades and your test scores fit well within that range, you might not need to apply to that many. So it really depends on the student and what they feel comfortable doing, and frankly, what their parents and family feel is appropriate. A lot of these applications have an application fee, and every time you send in your test scores, that's an additional fee. So you want to keep this in mind. But I think most students are going to be around 5 to 8 colleges, sometimes a little bit more. If you get a little bit less, that can be risky in this landscape. When I was applying to college, students only applied to a handful of colleges, but the competition to get in was nothing compared to what it is now. So I say, if you want to send in a couple extra applications, try to focus. If you're going to apply to a few extra, it should be colleges that you are really sure you've got a very good chance of getting admitted to. And ultimately, when you're looking at that final list, you want to be able to say to yourself and anybody who asks, I would be happy going to any one of those schools. And I know that when you send in an application, you want to get an acceptance back. But really, you just need one college to want you back. And the rest is up to you to get on that college campus and do great things. Because it's all about what you take advantage of in high school and what you take advantage of in college. And if you immerse yourself in that world, in that environment, and give everything you've got, you're going to get so much back in return.